This morning, we want to look at the final missionary journey that Paul took from Jerusalem to Rome, which is in Acts 27 and 28. And this journey was quite a dangerous sea voyage from Jerusalem to Rome. And this morning is going to be a different kind of sermon. It's going to be a geography lesson where we're going to look at the sea voyage. And so I'm asking you to bear with me. And this is when you all need to say, aye, aye, Captain. Try it. 1, 2, 3. All right. So what I've done is I've created a map, a bit of a reference map, that you'll see it progress as we journey through this story. And once we've worked our way through the text, we are going to look at some lessons that we might take home with us. But let me just say that the main point that I want us to take home from this story is that the faithfulness of God follows us through our trials and tribulations in life. God is faithful. That is the main point I want us to take home. But let me first give you some context to help us set the stage and to give us some understanding of what is going on in Acts 27 and 28. There are 3 things to keep in mind. First of all, Paul had an intense desire for Rome. In his letter to the Romans, which he wrote while he was in Corinth on his 3rd journey, he expresses in real personal language his intense desire to go to Rome. You see, Paul was a Roman, and as a Roman, the city of Rome was the center of the world. And from this great city, roads went out in all directions to all parts of the empire. To Paul, this gave him all the more desire to eventually get there. If only Rome could be thoroughly evangelized, what a radiating center for the gospel that it could become. And so, throughout the letter of Romans, we see several examples of this desire of Paul's. And at the beginning of Romans, in chapter 1, verse 10 to 15, Paul tells them, I pray now at last, by God's will, that the way may be open for me to come to you. Paul, he longed to see them so that he could strengthen them and encourage them in their faith. And then we're told that he had planned many times to go visit them, but every time up till now has been hindered. And then he goes on to say that because of all these hindrances, this is why I'm so eager to preach the gospel also to you who are at Rome. And so towards the end of Romans, in chapter 15, verse 20 to 29, we are told why he was prevented to go to Rome. Paul says that it has been my ambition to preach the gospel where Christ is not known, so that I will not be building on someone else's foundation. This is why I have often been hindered from coming to you. And then Paul goes on to explain that the region of Greece, which has been evangelized, and there was no more room for him in those regions. And so now his focus was on Rome. The great city of Rome dominated Paul's horizon. And so in his final stay at Jerusalem in Acts 23, his desire to go to Rome is once again hindered when he has to stand trial before the Sanhedrin, and his life is in danger from the Jews. And the Lord appears to Paul one night, and he says to him, and this is the key verse, he says this, take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, you must also testify in Rome. And then after this, Paul is transferred to Caesarea for his own safety, but he is held in custody there for 2 more years. And this is where we read in Acts 24 to 26 of Paul's trial before Felix, Festus, and King Agrippa. And we heard about this last week from Darren Clausen. And when Paul stood before Festus, in Acts 25, verse 11, he boldly appealed to Caesar. I think that Paul's appeal to Caesar was perfectly in line with God's calling on his life. He had to get to Rome. And he needed to find a way to make it happen so that he would not be stuck in the region of Jerusalem. And so as a Roman citizen, he appealed to Caesar. And that is how he guaranteed himself a trip to Rome. Number 2, Paul is an experienced seafarer. On the sea voyage from Acts in Acts 27-28, Paul, he stands out as a leader, and it's likely that he is one of the most experienced seafarers on that ship. In fact, if we go back and calculate all his previous 11 voyages on the Mediterranean before he set sail to Rome, we will find out that Paul has already traveled approximately 3,500 miles across the sea. And so in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 25-26, which was written a few years prior to Romans, Paul tells us that 3 times he was shipwrecked, and also that he spent a night and day out in the open sea, probably clinging to a piece of wood. And so Paul, he's used to the sea. He has seen the worst of it. And now, this voyage from Jerusalem to Rome is another 2,000 miles. Number 3, the narrative, precision, and detail. The precision and accuracy and vividness of this narrative is quite fascinating. And some would say that this is one of the most vivid pieces of descriptive narrative in the whole book, or indeed in the whole New Testament. What is fascinating about this is the repeated usage of personal pronouns in this section of Acts. It is referred to as the we section. Constantly, you will see the word we show up in this section. And because of this, it is widely acknowledged that Luke himself, the author of Acts, was on the voyage with Paul. It is almost as though Luke was writing a daily log as he was traveling across the sea. And so for Luke to pen such a detailed account is not without significance. And so with all of that in mind, let's begin in Acts 27, verse 1. I'm going to give you a paraphrased version of this story so that we're not reading every single verse. And by the way, you're going to see this map progress. You can see at Jerusalem, that red line. You're going to see that line progress, just to help you see where on this journey we are. Verse 1. When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, Paul and some other prisoners were handed over to a centurion named Julius, who belonged to the imperial regiment. Paul is most likely leaving from Caesarea because that is where he was held in custody for about 2 years. The other prisoners on board are probably already sentenced to death in the Roman arena for entertainment purposes. And so they boarded a coastal ship from Adramyttium, which was built not for the open sea, but a ship that follows the coastline. This ship was following the coastline and was heading up back to his home port in the northern part of the Aegean Sea. And we are told that a man named Aristarchus was with Paul. And we hear of him several other times in Scripture. He is referred to as Paul's travel companion in Acts chapter 19. And in Philemon 1 verse 24, he is named together with Luke as Paul's fellow worker. And so after a day at sea, they arrive in Sidon. And Julius, the centurion, he's kind enough to allow Paul to go visit his friends in Sidon so they may provide for his needs. And then after that, then they leave Sidon and they went out to sea again. And it says that they passed to the lee of Cyprus because the winds were against them. And when they sailed across the open sea off the coast of Cilicia and from Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. Here's where we start to see some of the seafarer language or nautical language. What is the lee of Cyprus? Since the prevailing winds were coming from the west, to pass to the lee of Cyprus is to sail onto the side of the island that would give them shelter. So, in other words, they passed to the shelter of Cyprus. That's what is meant by the lee of Cyprus. And so this journey from Caesarea to Myra was about 14 days. At the port in Myra, they got off the coastal ship, and the centurion went and found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and they boarded that ship. We find out later that this ship was carrying a cargo of grain that came from Alexandria in Egypt, which was Rome's main granary. In any case, we know that this Alexandrian ship is fit to travel across the open sea. And so we are told that they made slow headway for many days because the wind was coming from the west. And so as they arrived in Cnidus, which is probably the most southwestern tip of Asia Minor, and here's where things really start to get difficult. Now you'll see that we're going to zoom into that part of the map. And they're at Cnidus now. The journey from Italy to Cnidus would naturally continue west across the northern end of the Aegean Sea. That makes sense. But at this time, it was near the end of the summer, and the wind started to come from the northwest. And so because of these strong northwesterly winds, they had difficulty continuing west past Cnidus. And when the wind did not allow them to hold their course, they were forced to sail south, again, to the lee of Crete, to the lee of that island. We are told that they slowly moved along the southern coast of Crete and came to a place called Fair Havens. Are you all navigating with me so far? There we go. That's when you say, aye, aye, Captain. I just got to keep you on your toes. All right. So when they arrived at Fair Havens, much time had been lost. And we're told that already the Day of Atonement was past, which was in early October. This meant that they had now entered the dangerous season for sailing, which always had to stop by the beginning of November. It was clear to everyone on board that they could not go on to complete their journey to Italy, and so they would have to spend the winter somewhere. The question was whether they should lay up in Fair Havens or should seek a better harbor further along the western coast. Paul, being the experienced seafarer in the Mediterranean Sea, he speaks up, and he warns the crew that if they sail any farther, it would be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, even to their own lives. But the pilot and the owner of the ship, being a bit one-track minded, they just wanted to sail another 40 miles further to Phoenix, which was actually a better harbor to winter in. The centurion agreed, and they decided to sail on towards Phoenix. The next day, when a gentle south wind began to blow, they saw their opportunity. And so they weighed the anchor and sailed along the coast, the shore of Crete. They started to go up north. But it didn't take long, and a wind of hurricane force called the northeaster swept down from the island. And the ship was caught by the storm and could not head into the wind towards Phoenix. And so they gave way to the wind and were driven south. Now, the ship was in great danger because once they were blown out of the lee of Crete, there were no more harbors. There was no more island to find shelter from. Only the wide open sea. It is very interesting to read of what the crew on the ship did next to try to save the ship. First of all, they tried to take advantage of the brief shelter that the small island Cauda could offer them. And it bought them just enough time to pull aboard the lifeboat. Luke himself records that with great difficulty they were able to secure the lifeboat. One can imagine the blisters in his hand from trying to pull on the ropes. And then, number two, they passed ropes under the ship itself to hold its timber together from the wave crashing against the ship. And then, from fear of the Syrtis sandbar to the south, they lowered the sea anchor to act as a brake as they drifted onward. If they were to be driven south to the sandbar, the ship would smash to pieces and death would be certain. The next day, after such a violent pounding of the storm, they began to throw cargo overboard. And then on the third day of the storm, they threw the ship tackle equipment overboard with their own hand. And then finally, after 11 more days, when the sun or stars did not show up, when they did not appear in the sky, and the storm continued raging, they finally gave up all hope of being saved. At this point, the journey was at a very desperate situation. And it was in this desperate situation, after the crew had gone a long time without food, that Paul now steps in and he gives a word of encouragement. Paul first says, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail on from Crete. then you would have spared yourself this damage and loss. In other words, he's saying, I told you so. You should have listened to me back at Fair Havens. And he goes on, but now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost, only the ship will be destroyed. Last night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar. You will get to Rome. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as you told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. In other words, he's saying, I have faith that God is going to uphold his promise, even if we have to run aground on some island. And so now it was 14 days since they were driven from the shelter of Crete, and they were being helplessly driven across the Adriatic Sea. On the 14th night, at about midnight, the sailors started to sense that they were approaching land. They took sounding and found that the water was about 120 feet deep. A short time later, they took soundings again and found that it was 90 feet deep. Fearing that they would be dashed against the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, from the back of the ship, and they prayed for daylight. Now the sailors tried to escape. It's interesting here, they decided now they're going to try to escape. And so what they did was they went to the front of the ship and they pretended to lower the anchors at the front of the ship, but what they were actually doing is they were lowering the lifeboat. And Paul somehow knew about this. And Paul told the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men say with the ship, you cannot be saved. And so the soldiers went and they cut the rope and they let the lifeboat go. Very interesting part of the story. And just before dawn, Paul then urges the crew to eat. He said, for the last 14 days, you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive. Not one of you will lose a single hair from his head. Paul is reiterating what he said earlier, that not one of them would be destroyed. Only the ship, but they had to stay together. Then he initiates a meal by taking some bread, giving thanks to God in front of them all, and he begins to eat. This act of Paul encourages the rest of the crew, and they ate some food as well. And here we find out that there were 276 men on board. It has always struck me odd that Luke would give us that piece of detail. 276 men. Were they counted for the sake of distribution of food? Did they do a head count at the first light? Given the likelihood of serious injuries or loss of crew overboard in the terrible condition of the past 14 days? We don't know. We don't know why Luke gives us that piece of detail. But after they all ate as much as they wanted, what they did next is they took all the grain in the ship and they threw it overboard to lighten the ship. Remember, earlier, they sensed that they were approaching land, but they could not see it. So in other words, it was dark. And so now, when daylight came, they did not recognize the land, but they saw a bay with a sandy bar, with a sandy beach. And they decided that they were going to run the ship into that beach. So they cut the anchors loose. They untied the ropes that held the rudders. And then they hoisted the foresail to the wind and made for the beach. And when the ship struck the sandbar, the bow, the front of the ship, is now immovable. And the back of the ship was broken to pieces by the pounding of the waves. And when the soldiers feared that the prisoners would jump overboard and escape, they planned to kill them all. But the centurion, who wanted to spare Paul's life, kept them from doing so, and ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and to get to land. The rest were to get there on planks of wood from the ship. And in this way, everyone reached the land safely. Everyone reached the island of Malta safely, just as God had promised. And on the island of Malta, they stayed there for 3 months, for the winter. And the local treated them with unusual kindness by welcoming them and providing them the supplies they needed for the remainder of the voyage. Luke he gives us another detailed log of the last part of the voyage, which went much, much better than the first part. They found an Alexandrian ship that also stayed the winter at Malta. And with that, they sailed north to Syracuse. And by the way, I don't know if I'm pronouncing all these names correctly, but I'm trying. A lot of these names are different for me. And so they stayed in Syracuse for 3 days before they set sail again and arrived at Rhegium. The next day, a south wind came up, and on the following day, we reached Puteoli. There, Paul and his companion, they stayed with some Christian brothers and sisters for a week. And the final stretch of the journey was by land and most likely along the famous Appian Way, which led straight north to Rome. And by now, Christians in Rome, they found out about Paul coming, and so they traveled down as far as the Forum of Appius to meet them in order so that they can escort him to Rome. It must have been an emotional experience for Paul to meet for the first time the residents in the city of his dream and the first members of the church to which he wrote the book of Romans. And so that brings us to the end of this crazy journey. So, what do we do with this? How can we apply this story to our lives? There are two things that I want us to consider. First of all, the parallel between Jesus and Paul. Something that I think is very interesting with the story is the parallel to the story of Jesus. The Apostle Luke, he wrote both this book of Acts as well as his own gospel. And so one has to wonder if Luke crafted this story to match somewhat the same story in his gospel. A major portion of the Gospel of Luke records a journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And the final third section of Acts records a journey from Jerusalem to Rome. Jerusalem was the goal of Jesus' ministry, and Rome was the goal of Paul's. These parallel journeys differ from each other both in direction and destination, but there are many similarities in the pattern. They both included a stubborn determination, an arrest, a series of trials, both in the Jewish and Roman courts, suffering, and even death and resurrection. For Paul, descent into darkness and danger of the storm is a kind of grave, while his rescue from shipwreck and later springtime voyage to Rome is a kind of resurrection. Paul was so conformed to the life of the Lord that even his suffering and deliverance are a parallel. It reminds me of what Paul says in Philippians 3, verse 10 to 11. I want to know Christ and the power of his resurrection and the fellowship of sharing in his sufferings, becoming like him in his death, and so somehow to attain to the resurrection of the dead. So the question is, do we run from our trial and suffering? Do we run from them, or do we welcome them? I remember when I was in grade 11, my closest friend, Alfred Reimer, my best friend, he passed away. And it was probably the hardest time in my life. I remember for a few days sitting there and just trying my best to push away that pain, wishing that it was just a dream, that it wasn't reality. But once I embraced that reality, only then did God bring a healing into my life, that a particular area of my life that I really needed healing in. But that healing only came once I embraced the reality of my best friend's death. So rather than running from our trials and suffering, we need to embrace them like Paul did and let God work in and through them. And this leads me to my next point. The faithfulness of God follows us through our trials and tribulations of life. God promised Paul in advance that he will get to Rome. And we already know from the beginning how the story is going to end. But as the narrative progresses, the storm becomes more and more violent until all hope is lost. And we wonder, how on earth is Paul going to be rescued? And in this desperate situation, the angel speaks to Paul and reminds him of God's promise. Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God will save the lives of all of you on the ship. One of the reasons why Paul goes into such length to describe the details of this journey is to reveal just how traumatic this experience was. Luke wants us to know that against the human helplessness of the frightening adventure stands the sovereign hand of God. The faithfulness of God will never be thwarted. His promises will always come true in our hardest moments. Can we remind ourselves that God is faithful? And that whatever comes of our situation, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purposes. We may never have been out at sea in the midst of a terrible storm, but we all have experienced different storms in our lives. Some of these storms may cause us to despair and give up all hope, maybe even our own lives. But no matter what we face, be it death, suffering, sickness, depression, anxiety, may we remember that no trial has seized us except what is common to man. God is faithful. He will not let us face a trial beyond what we can bear. But when we are tested, he will also provide a way out so that we can stand up under it, so that we can endure it. This is why Paul also declared in Romans 8 that in all things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For there is nothing in all creation, nothing that can separate us from the love of God. God will get us through our pain. That is a promise. He doesn't tell us how he will get us through the pain. He will get us through our struggles. He will get us through our trials. And he will bring beauty from the ashes. And his faithfulness will never, ever give up. We just have to trust him. May the Lord richly bless you this morning. Amen.